Welcome to the Business Bloke podcast. Growing your business doesn't have to be hard. I am your host, Andrew Savage, a business and mindset coach with plenty of leadership tools and strategies to help you grow your life and business. Give yourself permission to get curious, lean in, and enjoy this episode. Today in the studio, I have Ben Law. Ben is an advisor in the financial and succession space, if I've kind of got that right. You can elaborate on that a little bit, but I'd love for you to tell us something about yourself that most people don't actually know.
Well, g'day, Andrew. Thanks for having me here today. As I said a few minutes ago, it's a little bit nerve-wracking to be on the other side of the microphone, so to speak, and be the one being interviewed, but I'll give it a good crack. So, you sent the email through the other day saying, Ben, I just want you to think about something that people won't know about you. And the problem is I'm a bit of an open book. I don't have too many secrets floating around. And so I was thinking through this, and I thought the one thing that most people probably wouldn't know about me is I talk to myself a lot. And when I say I talk to myself, I don't mean in my head out loud. And the reason I figured out I do this is about 2 years ago, I remember I was doing this, having a conversation with myself, which sounds like I'm batshit crazy, but I'm not. Just bear with me. And my daughter came in and she said, Dad, who are you talking to? And I stopped and looked at her and said, myself, sweetheart. She goes, why are you having a conversation with yourself? And I said, well, that's how I think. And so one of the things that I learnt over the years is I've got a lot going on in my head. There's a lot of stuff going on. And sometimes I just find when I've got a real problem that I'm trying to work through, I'll actually not only have the conversation in my head, but sometimes I'll have it out loud. So I'll actually question what I'm thinking. And usually I do it when I'm in the car or in the shower. So it's a really strange habit that I've got.
I was always told it was the first sign of insanity. So you've been a bit nuts for a while then, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, definitely. I keep telling my wife that it's the first sign of genius, but, insanity is probably more accurate.
There is something quite profound in that, though, when you actually, as podcasters, listening to yourself, and if you're doing a presentation, maybe you practice a speech and you record yourself on video or something to that. But it's quite profoundly different thinking something than it is actually speaking it, isn't it?
It is. And the reason I did it was because I have a real negative self-talk in my head quite often, which I find a lot of people do. And so what I actually found is that if I actually have these loops going on in my head, or I've got a problem that keeps coming into my head, I either sit down and write down the question. I'll ask it out loud. I'll say, well, look, what's worrying me? What am I thinking about? What keeps going on in my head? And the practice of writing it down or saying it out loud then allows me to question it. So is this true? Does that make sense? What else could this mean? And it's just become a habit I've had over the years. And I think it came down to, Andrew, sitting in the car so often. When I was a financial advisor, I'd do 40, 50,000 Ks a year going out and seeing families on the land as a financial advisor. And I had all that time and I used to just have those conversations, and it works beautifully for me.
That's perfect. Yeah, no, I love it. It's really cool. And another thing I think you talk about writing is you are a recidivist or notorious sticky post-it note poster person.
I am. If you look around my room, it looks like a Muppet's thrown up in here. They're all over the wall, all different quotes and things to remember.
No, but powerful stuff, getting it from the unconscious to the conscious and getting it out there, whether it's Muppet spew or weird, crazy talkings to yourself. You touched on families in that conversation. I'd love to hear a little bit about what you do in your coaching business. I know you do a lot with families and family succession, which is a real problem, I guess. You frame it as in our industry, in Australasia and around the world, really, is that whole succession and exit strategy piece. I'd love to touch on what it is you do and how you do it.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting space, and I suppose I tackle this problem, Andrew, a little bit differently. But what I want to go back and is just talk a little bit about my why I'm in the space that I am. So I spent 20 odd years as a financial advisor, grew my own practice, and I retired from that industry. 2020 was when I pulled up stumps there, and I'd spent 20 odd years working with families, helping them grow, protect and transition their wealth. And I was quite good at that. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way, just in I'd spent 20,000 hours learning how to do it. So I became good at it. And what I seemed to notice was that so many families suffered from what I call the 3-generation curse, which is, if anyone's heard of that, it's the 2 to make it, 1 to lose it. From shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And it's just essentially that intergenerationally, especially in the farming or the business space, we seem to have prosperity or success for sort of 2 or 3 generations, and then the wheels fall off. And that's essentially the major problem with succession, is how do we transfer wealth or the family wealth from one generation to another and then maintain it? And so myself personally, I have first-hand experience in that, in the sense that I would have been the 4th generation on the family farm. My dad's still on the farm, but I'm not. And it was because of what I call the 3-generation curse. So essentially, I've dedicated my business to helping families avoid the 3-generation curse. And part of that is actually succession. So part of the solution. How do we transfer from one generation to another? Except the major problem I see in the industry, Andrew, is we focus on the symptoms, not the major problem. And what I mean by the symptoms is we get to the point where succession in a family business, where it becomes where someone wants to transition that asset or that business or that wealth, and that's where we attack it. Whereas for me, I want to swim back upstream, and tackle the problems at the beginning, where they are at the root cause of those problems. And that's what I've built a business around. And yeah, I love it.
That's awesome. I love that. And how, when you talk about swimming upstream and the wheels falling off and those types of things, I'd love to know some common threads, I suppose, those sort of breakdowns in communication, or because things can get quite heated and nasty and families fall apart. And what is the common thread amongst all of these people that you see?
Yeah, look, what I'd like to talk about is what's the common thread in people that are successful rather than unsuccessful in this space. Yeah, and I think the reason I want to do that is because the number one complaint I used to make, and people still make today, is they hear about all the doom and gloom stories. They talk about these are all the problems that can happen. But what I want to talk about is the families that succeed in this space and seem to do well. And the number one factor that I see in that is what I call prosperity. Now, prosperity is a bit of an old-fashioned word. You don't hear it used around too much today. I used to use the word success. So I used to talk about successful families. But what I realized is that success comes with some real problems, because you can be highly successful in your business. You can have a large business, hundreds of thousands of acres, tens of thousands of head of cattle, whatever it might be, but you can not be successful overall in your life. Or alternatively, you could have a really successful family, family that loves each other, is close to each other, but you can be financially bankrupt and you're not overly successful. So I love to use the word prosperous. And so what I came to realize is that the real, what I call prosperous families, there are some common threads in there that make them prosperous. And the number one thread is that the families see financial strength as just as important as financial strength. So they have a balance between both making sure they're financially successful in their business or their farming operation, but also the family unit is really strong. And the families that do that, I call what we call high-performing families. So they have a great balance between the two. Families that seem to come unstuck is they either have a lack of focus on financial success or financial strength, or they have a lack of focus on family unit strength. And when you don't have both of those, that's where you run into strife.
Yeah, no, that really makes perfect sense. And a lot can be said for that in our general lives as well, isn't it? We go to the gym and then on the way home, we kind of get a big burger to eat as well. So it's sort of, why do we have these conflicts in our life? It's really fascinating. So what is some things that you do work with people around, maybe it's family or financial in that family space? What is it that makes a successful family in that, non-financial area?
Well, that's a good question, because it's complicated and it's multifaceted. But the number one, when I first talk to families, I talk to them about the fact that most families, when you dig into it, Andrew, want to become more prosperous. And intrinsically, when you dig into it, when you dig past all the guff and the rubbish, they want their farm to be financially successful. Absolutely. They want to kick some goals there. But they also want their family to be strong and have good family harmony and feel fulfilled. I'm gonna mess that up, aren't I? Feel fulfilled in life. And what has to happen is what's required is what I call a growth mindset. So what I mean by that is families need to be sitting down and going, okay, asking them this question for themselves is, would we like things to be better than they are now? And invariably, they always say yes. And it's like, well, if we do want things to be better than they are now, what things do we want to fix and what are they? And how do we go about it? Now, that could be, we'd like our relationships to be better. It could be our business to be better. We want scale. We want to retire soon. But ultimately, that growth mindset to be always looking at things and saying, how do we do better? Does that make sense?
Oh, no, it makes perfect sense. And I have, I guess had it heard that sometimes it's, say the father's been on this farm and he's entering his 60s. Sometimes there's a bit of a pride or significance piece. How my son is coming into the business. They've got very different values, but sometimes they actually don't want the son to do things better than they did because, there is a lot of pride to do with how they've come along. But man, the technology and the world has changed so much so quickly, and I imagine that sometimes it's those intergenerational, I guess, beliefs and conversations and things that really are really important in that space for people to be able to move forward to really get that understanding of each other.
Yeah, it is. And that's the growth mindset. It's being able to think at things and go, okay, just because we've done this for 4 or 5 years and it works doesn't mean that it'll work next year. It's always having that, how do we do things better? And if you look at, I'll go back one more step. Sorry, Andrew. If you look at the families that really succeed, they are humble enough to be able to go, we don't know how to do this better, and they embrace the next generation coming through. So they're really starting to think about, okay, well, how do we actually harness the value of the next generation and not just sort of put it down to youthful over exuberance and actually foster that? Because here's the thing: there's 4 key reasons that these things fail. Number one is professional advisors get it wrong. So when we're transitioning wealth from one generation to another, the financial advisor, the accountant, the lawyer, they stuff it up. They get the tax wrong. They get the legal structures wrong. That's the first thing. The second thing is the fact that the family aren't aligned. They're not on all the same page. So that could be dad's a stubborn old coot that just wants to do the same things the same way always, or it could be the younger ones are really aggressive and really risk tolerant and they just want to smash it out of the park, or it could be we've got lazy and entitled children, but we're not all on the same page. So a lack of family alignment and a lack of strategic plan, like we're not all on the same page. The next factor, the third factor, is essentially what we say is preparing the heirs. So preparing the next generation to take over the business. And the last area is communication and trust. The communication is really poor and trust starts to break down over time. So unless we address all those areas, we're never going to be able to get there. And again, we have to have the older generation humble enough to be able to go, look, I don't have all the answers, and the way I've done it isn't necessarily always right. And we need the younger generation to go, hey, I'm driven, I'm risk tolerant, I want to get ahead and I want to take over. But hey, there's a bit of wisdom in what mum and dad have done over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And there's a bit of wisdom of what grandfather did. Maybe I should be open-minded enough to be able to listen to what they've got to say and find out, and maybe we can learn something. And I interviewed a family up at Beef Week, the Lord family, and one of the things that Nico's the next generation coming through, was he said, when I came back from ag college, I was driven and I was motivated, and Dad and I were just butting heads. And he said, 15 years down the track, I look back and go, gee, I'm glad Dad pushed back against me.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't have got where I was. And Dad looks back and goes, gee, I'm glad I let Nico had enough space to be able to think through those things. So we've got to really treat this like a almost like a learning experience. We've got to try and prepare the heirs to take over in the next generation without cramping that enthusiasm and drive to do better.
I don't know why the word osmosis popped into my head then, but it is. It's like this. You kind of got something squishy, and you got to let a little bit of each one through to keep it whole. And I always think my father passed away, 20 something years ago now. And if he came back to life today, he was a dairy farmer and had been his whole life. Like, what would he be thinking? We've got cows with virtual fences, and a post. I mean, that was not something. Facebook wasn't around. So now, if we talk about a post, we sort of talk about Facebook. He would have no clue. It'd be like coming into a completely foreign country for him. So I think it's really important, because there are still principles of how he farmed that are really important today. Soil stewardship and how we look after our land, and he always had the aspect that we were guardians of our properties. We never really owned it. So there are certain traits that are really important for us to carry through those generations, for sure.
Yeah, and I think, so my opinion is, Andrew, with this is, it all comes back to values. We may disagree with how the farming practices were done in the past, but we can all pretty much agree that our values don't change that much over time. Yes, they'll be slightly different. I agree. Like, brothers and sisters will have different values. Mum and dad will have different values. Mum and dad to the kids will have slightly different values, but there'll be core values we all share. And when I speak to farmers and graziers, ostensibly some of the key ones, mate, are work ethic. So work hard. That's a really strong one. Be a good steward of the land and your animals, care for those. Family's really important. That's a really important one. Always be growing and doing better. That's another one. And so I think that if we can find those shared values and a common purpose, that takes out a lot of the problems in families. It takes a lot of those problems out, because I go back to when I used to play football, rugby at school, and I can remember when I first started in the team in the local team, there was 4 or 5 guys on the team that were complete drongos, and I didn't have any time for. I wasn't mates with them, and we had nothing in common. And then all of a sudden we started playing football together, and we had a common purpose, which was to win the game of football. And we were part of a team. And it was amazing how much that friction just disappeared over time. Yeah, we were never going to become best mates, but you found a common purpose. And then a lot of that friction that was there just disappeared. And it's the same for families. If you can find a common purpose, which is a vision for the family wealth, what's the purpose of this wealth? And then we could all get on the same page, a lot of the friction starts to disappear. You'd be surprised how quick that actually happens.
A real good example of that is, there's no stronger passion than a state of origin, which has just been a couple of weeks ago, the Queensland versus New South Wales. And not only do they align themselves as a team in a sport, then they bring in, where are you from? And like, it just gets so heated, but the passion behind it is unparalleled, I think, to any sporting event, probably around the world. And there's nothing that aligns a team like a common mission. And that can be same as our family if we treat that as a team as well.
Mm. Absolutely. And one of the things that I really have focused on, and I think this is because of my background in financial advice, is the place that I start with families is we start with values. What are the family values that we hold dear? And we really have to figure those out, because they're the things that guide the family, everyone in the family, and they also help keep us on an even keel. The second part we go into is purpose cause or passion. What's the purpose of this family wealth? We've got $5 million tied up in this farming asset or a business, or we've got $500 million tied up in this. What's the actual purpose of this wealth? And when you sit a family down and you go, especially to the older generation, you might say to mum and dad, and let's say they're in their 70s or 80s, what's the purpose of this wealth? And they look at you and go, what do you mean? And you ask the younger generation, what's the purpose of this wealth? And if you don't know what's the purpose of the wealth, like, why are we doing this? What are we doing? So we need to drill down and understand what the purpose of the wealth is. Is it to provide financial security for the family? Is it to teach them how to manage wealth? Is it to help educate the kids? Is it to help them have more freedom? Is it to provide opportunity for all generations? What is the purpose behind it? And I think when you figure out that purpose, what it's for, again, that takes a lot of the friction out and it gets everyone on the same page. Like with State of Origin, the goal is to get the ball to the other end of the field across that try line and beat the hell out of the other team. In a family, if you've got a common purpose, yeah, you might have some friction in the team, but when you know what that common purpose and you're all aligned to that common purpose and you all agree that's the common purpose and these are the values, these are the rules we play the game by, well then, again, so much less friction.
Unstoppable. I'd love to know about values. And a lot of companies have values and they put them up on the wall and an accountant or a lawyer wrote them and some of them are terrible. And within that company, everyone has their own values. I'd love to get your take on, is it about you will align with my values, or is it about us understanding each other's values and how we meet them?
So for me, there's a combination of them, but this main purpose is, as I talked about just then, is to how do we all agree these are our common values, and this is how we make decisions, a framework for making decisions as a family, and also a way of managing behaviour. So, for example, one of the values that I have in my family, because we very much talk about values in our family with our daughter who's 8, and we'll say is one of them is a can-do attitude. Now that's not the typical value you'd see around integrity and honesty and hard work, whatever those values are. But we use that with Sophie and also with Sarah, my wife, and myself, is to go, well, if an opportunity crops up, are we a can do or are we a can't do? And so that's helped us so many times where we've had something that's challenging come up, like we want to go on this holiday and there's all these barriers to getting there. And it's like, it's all too hard, we won't go do it. It's like, well, are we a can do family or a can't family? Another one of my personal values is always add value. And so it's like everyone I work with, it's like, how can I add more value than I take? So when we talked about this podcast, it's like, well, how can I add as much value as I possibly can to the people listening? And so this drives everything we do. And I think a lot of companies use it as lip service. It's just one of those tick the box and we've talked about our values. But a family business should really work out these values, document them, and then live by them. And they should talk about them regularly. And one of the things that I've found, Andrew, became really valuable through this process is one of the families I worked with has a really big business with a lot of employees. And we worked out the family values. We put the family values up in the business. And then one of the things they do is when they get problems with their employees, they go back and they go, well, one of our values is, for example, always take initiative. So one of their values was initiative. And then one of the employees comes back and they haven't taken the initiative. They're like, well, one of our values is take the initiative. Are you taking the initiative and fixing this problem? And they're like, oh, no. Well, then they hold their staff or their family accountable for that. So values are only important when you actually hold people accountable to those values.
I struggle with KPIs, and I feel like if you're having a conversation, a disciplinary conversation or whatever it is with staff, dragging out a KPI, subsection 1, clause 2, thou will do whatever, as opposed to, hey, that behaviour doesn't quite align with our family values. Is there another way we can approach this? It's a different conversation.
It is. And I personally, I hire and fire all the people that I work with based on matching values. So if I have a family come to me, Andrew, and I look at them and I go, your family your values that you prescribe to don't match mine, I don't take them on. Okay, so I don't take them on. Same with accountants, lawyers, bankers, financial advisors, etc. If they don't have similar values to me, I'm going to get rid of them and I'm not going to do business with them. And the reason is because every time I've gone back and looked at problems with clients or with service providers, so professional people, accountants, lawyers, bankers, it's always been a values mismatch. Same with employees. If you bring employees in and their personal values don't match yours, I guarantee you at some stage you're going to have a dust up with them or some friction. Whereas if you find people that have matching values, it makes life so much easier.
Yeah, we could prevent a lot of heartache if we all went by this philosophy. And in your, I guess, circles and stuff, you've done a lot of, I guess, transfer or transition of wealth or assisted with the transition of wealth. Make it sound like you're running around with big suitcases full of gold somewhere around in inland Queensland. But a part of, and I have had someone say, hey, if you're ever talking to Ben, can you ask this question? And it is a problem in my circles of work a lot with dairy farmers, is that kind of building wealth outside the farm. And I think about succession. I also think about exit strategy. And like, we should always have an exit strategy. Like, when you start a business, you should have an exit strategy. A lot of this probably is about exit strategy and how do you transfer that wealth? Like, what sort of things should you be looking at to do with that wealth to carry on that growth mindset, just like you said? I'd love to hear some strategies around that.
Okay. Well, the first thing I have to say is I'm no longer a financial advisor and I'm not allowed to give financial advice. So this is just really general information. So
me too.
The first, the first thing is when I was back as a financial advisor, I used to see so many families come in trying to get to the point of doing a succession transition. And what they found is there wasn't enough off-farm assets. Mum and dad wanted to retire. They said, we need $1 million or a couple of $1 million to buy a house and then live for the rest of our lives. And there was no money there to do it. And then either the next generation had to borrow money to buy mum and dad out, so to speak, which is fine. Most of them don't. They're like, mum and dad deserve that. They've worked hard. We have no problems with that. But then that leaves the business financially unviable. Now, for a lot of dairy farmers and a lot of people that are highly leveraged, what they find is there's not enough cash flow to be able to build off-farm assets. That becomes really tough. So that's another discussion. But essentially what I tell people is, if that's a major one of the major reasons successions fail or run into major problems is there's not enough off-farm assets. Swimming up the stream, any of the younger people listening, you need to start building your off-farm assets. And what I mean by that is it might be shares, it might be superannuation, it might be buying an investment property. You need to start doing that early, because if you start early, the benefit of compounding returns over time, you can put a small amount away each year into off-farm assets. It might be $100 a week, it might be $1,000 a week, whatever that number is you can afford. 10, 15, 20 years down the track, it's going to be a huge amount of money. That's the first thing.
Are you telling me that if you enter a share farming agreement or something like that, that you should not go out and buy a brand new Toyota Hilux?
Well, you should do whatever the hell you want to do, but it depends on how you want to think through things. And the way I try and change people's paradigms is that when you think about your off-farm assets, you're actually essentially putting your future self on the payroll. So there's a future Ben or a future Andrew at 60 to 70 years of age that's essentially going to want to retire. Now, if you want to sell the farm, that's fine. No problems. That can be your retirement nest egg. But if you want to transition that farming asset to the next generation, you need to start think about that. And the best way to think about it is, I'm going to put future Ben, future Andrew on the payroll, and I'm going to pay them each week, each month, whatever it is, into off-farm assets, and get advice. Like, make sure you go get advice from the right people, because a lot of farmers have got burnt over the years. Now, it doesn't have to be complicated. The simpler it is, the better, but you want to be having an amount going over each month. Now, if you get to the point where you go, well, look, Ben, I haven't done that. I'm 50, 55, 60, and now I'm sitting on this asset, there's no spare cash flow. We'll start planning your exit. What's this going to look like? If the next generation are going to take over, like, figure it out early. What's the strategy we've actually got to do? Where are we going to go? How are we going to make? Don't leave it to the last minute. And if you don't think there's going to be enough money in the pot, or the next generation's going to have to take on too much debt to be able to buy you out, well, then you need to figure that out and then have the hard discussions as a family if it's not going to work. Because a problem or a disagreement or a problem deferred or kicked down the road is a problem magnified. Very seldom do those problems just resolve themselves. Communication and financial problems, they just don't resolve themselves. And so we want to really be getting advice and thinking about that. What does retirement look like to me? Now, women are far smarter than men. They start thinking, on average, in their early 50s, they're thinking, geez, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life, Andrew. Like, I want to have some balance. I want to go see the grandkids. I want to travel. I want to do something other than chasing cattle around. I don't necessarily want to go sit on the beach in a unit and do nothing, but I don't want to do this forever. Dads, man, we're a bit slower. We think we can work forever. And then about 58 to 60, there's something in our heads that change where we go, holy shit, I'm not 25 anymore.
Usually a hip replacement. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever it might be. And so we start thinking through that. And so I'd say get some advice early, start thinking it through and talking to the next generation, because, if it's going to have to be decided at some stage, and it's better to decide it when you in advance and plan towards it than to leave it to the last minute.
I love it. The best time to start is now.
Yeah, and sorry, one last thing, Andrew, just to put in too, is my one piece of non-financial advice is be very, very careful around what I call the frog succession plan, which is you'll get it when I croak. Okay, because that is just a major problem. You want to address these problems well in advance, even if you're going to, no one's coming to take over the farm. So let's say, using the dairy farmer analogy, and you say, look, no one wants to come back. We've got this substantial amount of money. We need to think about, well, what does that transition look like? What's going to happen? Because this is a major problem that the rural industry is not talking about, which I can clearly see, is there's going to be a bucket load of young-ish people in the rural space over the next 20 years where mum and dad are going to fall off the perch. That farm's going to be sold. There's going to be significant wealth tied up in it, 10s, 20s, 30s of millions worth of land that's going to be sold, and it's going to drop into beneficiaries' bank accounts. Now, if they haven't learnt how to manage that money, that's going to be an absolute curse to them. Okay, that's part of the 3-generation curse, because you look at the stats around lotto winners, something like 70% of them have lost all their money. Sorry, 70% of them are bankrupt within 5 years, and 90% of them have lost the money. Sorry, I probably got those stats wrong. Let's just ignore that. But a substantial portion of them bankrupt. It's bad. So if you think about kids or young adults that are going to inherit this money, and it's going to be a large amount of money, what's that going to do for their lives if they don't know how to manage that? What's it going to do for relationships? And if it's not going to cause problem for the kids, I can guarantee it will for the grandkids. Bad decisions, unable to manage money, lost opportunity, and finally, entitlement and laziness is going to kick in. So all of a sudden, that legacy that you've thought, well, when I die, they'll get the farm. Eventually, it's going to get sold, and someone's going to make a lot of money out of it. And is it going to create more of a problem than a benefit?
It's so much. There's so much in that, isn't there? And you have all these visions into your head, and like, does a child approach their dad and say, what's happening with the farm, and does dad initiate this? How do you initiate these conversations? It's really challenging, and especially with adult siblings on the in the mix as well.
Yeah, it is. It's complicated, and the problem with it is, this is why I said the number one success factor is personal growth. It's having that growth mindset where we're in a position where mum and dad think, okay, well, we don't have all the answers. Let's not stick our head in the sand. Let's start to address these. Same with the next generation. We don't have all the answers. Maybe we approach mum and dad. And for anyone out there that's sitting in this position where they're going, oh, gee, Ben, you've opened a can of worms here. I hadn't even thought of that. Well, my advice is to go start having conversations with the family. So I've got families that I've worked with that have got, there might be $50 or $100 million worth of assets, and none of the kids want to come back on the farm. And we sit down and we go, okay, and they say, oh, well, that's a good result in some ways, Ben, because, well, we don't have to worry about multiple kids coming back, and how do we deal with that, etc. I'm like, no, you've got a bigger problem, because you're 60, 65. In another 10 years, let's assume that doubles and there's 50 million, that's 100 million. And let's say you live till you're 90, there could be $200, $300, $400 million worth of assets there that your kids are going to get. So maybe we need to start having conversations with those kids and having family meetings about, well, what does this look like? What's going to happen over the next 10 to 15 years? Do we start to transition some wealth now? Do we sell some blocks and then transition some wealth to the kids to be able to learn how to manage that wealth with some provisos? Do we have conversations about what the wealth means to the family, what's expected of them? Because eventually they're going to get it. eventually it's going to come through. So this is the conversations that need to get had. And a major mistake a lot of families go is, well, my daughter's a lawyer or my son's a banker, they'll know how to manage the money. No, they're not taught how to manage wealth and all the impacts on it. Because I don't know if you've noticed, Andrew, but I see it all the time now, is on social media, you're seeing all these multi-squillionaires, like hundreds and hundreds, maybe even billions, that are saying, hey, I'm leaving a small amount of money to my kids. It's like, you're worth $1 billion. Why are you only leaving a small amount? What's a small amount? Probably just under $1 million. They can buy a house and that's enough. And it's like, so you're going to give your billions away and leave your kids with $1 million. What's the reason behind that? He's like, well, they don't know how to manage the money. It's just going to destroy their lives and my grandkids' lives. They need to go out and learn how to work. So if the billionaires are starting to think like that, farmers are going to have to start to think like that. Now, I'm not suggesting you give your money away. I say swim upstream and teach your kids how to manage wealth. But you've got to go through a process. It doesn't happen easily.
Yeah, no, it's huge, isn't it? And like I say, there's all those things that come into it. And I think we mentioned last time how I've blown away how people introduce themselves in mainland Australia. Farmers, they start with, I am a second generation, third generation farmer, and it's quite foreign. And I guess there's that huge amount of pride associated with making sure it's successfully handed to the next generation.
Yeah. And there's a whole lot of shame when it's not, Andrew. This is the thing. And one of the things that I've really noticed in the last 10 years of my experience, because I've been doing this for almost 25 years now. I'm showing my age. But one of the things I've noticed is there's those that feel this intense need to be able to hand on a farm, and that's generally in the male side, this intense need to hand on a farm. And so that causes them stress and anxiety and worry. They want to be able to leave it to one or to two or something that's viable. The second one is the one that's inherited the farm, that's quite a substantial holding, and they feel stress and anxiety and pressure based on the fact that they feel guilty. You know, there's 3, 4, 5 generations that have come before me and I've taken over. I feel this intense obligation to be able to match what they did. And so we've got to get down and think, okay, well, if that's the case, is this actually the way you should think? Or is there a better way to think about this?
So much value. I usually limit these to 25 minutes. We could go for probably 25 hours, but time flies when you're having fun. Or I guess so someone's listening and going, you know, I need to start something now, whether that's an exit strategy or building wealth off farm. Like, what's your, I guess, key takeaway to someone who needs to have a conversation either with themselves or with the people around you in this space?
Yeah, well, I think if they want to start building off-farm wealth, the first thing is to just, that's the first one, ask why. Why the hell am I doing this? And find a really strong why. Now, if you don't have a strong why, at the first sign of difficulty, you're going to give up. And that's what I find business owners or farmers and graziers do all the time. So they need to do that. The second thing is get some good advice. You know, maybe start with your accountant about saying, you know, what entity do I use? Do I invest in my own name? Do I have a company? Do I have a trust? Do I have super? Accountant or financial advisor would be really good. But the first thing I would do is, if you're serious about this, is set up a separate bank account. And this isn't financial advice. This is just common sense. Set up a separate bank account and call that my off-farm investment account, and start transferring money over there regularly. And if it's $100 a week, $100 a month, $10 a month, whatever it is, and start transitioning it across. And so that when you're ready to start investing off-farm, you've already got that habit, because it's the habit of regularly investing off-farm that will make you successful. That's number one. So why? And start doing that. If someone's going to look at having an exit strategy, well, the first thing is I think they need to name that and say, and be really honest and have a conversation with our significant other, husband, wife, etc., partner, is say, well, look, we need to start thinking about what our exit strategy looks like, and then start to think about, well, what do I want to actually happen? What do I actually want to have happen? Do I want to actually sell up? Do I not want to sell up? What do I want my life to look like over the next 10 years? And really get that clear in your head, and then go get some help. The number one thing is it's complicated. it can be complicated, it can be difficult, and you'll hit roadblocks, but you need to go out there and find the right person. And quite often what people do is they'll talk to their accountant, they'll talk to their bank manager, they'll speak to their lawyer, their financial advisor to start the conversation, and maybe even a succession planning facilitator, someone that can do that, and then have a family meeting about it. If you've got kids coming back, is have the conversation with them and sit down in a formal setting and say, hey, eventually your mum and I are going to retire. We know that. And we'd like to do that and have a conversation as a family. And if you can't have a proper conversation as a family, we'll then get someone to come in and mediate or facilitate or help you.
Such good advice. Yeah, it's so important that people just take that step.
Yeah, well, I think naming it's really important, Andrew, is to be able to go, because so many people just stick their head in the sand, and I call it the head in the sand syndrome. It just doesn't work, because when your head's stuck in the sand, something's more likely going to come along and bite you in the ass. It really is. And I think if you can just name it and start to talk about it, because, mate, when we're all getting older, we're not getting any younger, and eventually you're going to have to transition. And whether that be in a pine box or into a nursing home or off to a nice unit on the beach or into a cottage on the farm so the next generation can take over, whatever that wants to be, my advice is work out for you what the bloody hell you want to have happen, and then work towards making that happen, because too many people have got to the last moment and then been shoehorned into something they didn't want.
You've got some cool platforms that people can follow. You've got a podcast, some other things that someone who's like, I'm a bit curious about this. How do I find out more? So yeah, how does someone find out more?
Look, just head on over to the Financial Bloke or the Agricoach podcast. I'm the Financial Bloke. The podcast is Agricoach. Just go on to Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or jump on the Financial Bloke website or Agricoach website, thefinancialbloke.com.au or agricoach.com.au, or you can find me on the socials under the Financial Bloke, Facebook, and I think Twitter and Instagram.
You got them all covered. I just wanted it to be known that I didn't call my podcast The Business Bloke because of you. So,
mate, it's a cool name. I love it.
Yeah. You've offered so much gold. I know you're a very busy person. I want to thank you heaps and heaps for your time coming in and sharing so much wisdom with us. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's always happy to help and share a little bit of wisdom if I can from time to time. And thanks so much for having me on. We'll have you on the podcast at some stage to talk about all your specializations. But if anyone's got any questions or problems, feel free to send me an email, admin@thefinancialbloke.com.au, and I'll see if I can either help or point you in the right direction.
Perfect. Very generous. Thank you very much. If you've got this far, you've reached the end of the episode, or you've left your car running. I really hope you got something out of this episode of the Business Bloke podcast, and maybe you've got something to take away to apply to your own business. I'm a pretty friendly bloke, so you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Just look up Andrew Savage, or on Instagram. The handle is TheBusinessBloke. Thanks for listening. Reach out, and we'll catch up with you soon. Good one. Cheers.